A warm welcome to all of you, lovers of history, architecture, and New York, who are gathered here today to honor the life and work of the legendary architecture critic Ada Louise Huxtable. I'm Barbaralee Diamonstein-Spielvogel, the chair of the Historic Landmarks Preservation Center and the New York City Landmarks 50 Alliance, a committee of distinguished and dedicated individuals, 103 member organizations committed to informing the public about the past, present, and future of historic preservation in our city. Our special thanks to all the members of the board and the shareholders of 969 Park Avenue, to Frampton Tolbert and Simeon Bangkok, the Historic Districts Council, our collaborators, and our faithful, excellent project director, Deborah Bershad. Welcome to all of you. Ada Louise Huxtable, born Ada Louise Landman, just on the other side of the park, was a native New Yorker who found the soul of the city in its streets, and with a native New Yorker's inventiveness, created a new profession and a new discourse, that of architectural criticism. Often referred to as the dean of American architectural criticism, she was the first full-time architectural critic at an American newspaper, the New York Times. By revealing the ins and a lot of the outs of design, planning, and eventually historic preservation to her readers, she and her successors successfully have focused our attention on how we see and think about the built environment. She increasingly made us aware of New York City's rich architectural heritage, and that is apparent, too, with the dedication of the shareholders of this building. My admiration and regard for your stewardship. These buildings, it is said, are cultural resources that are inherited from our ancestors and borrowed from our children. And her writing and that of her colleagues has urged us to honor and continue this pact. And now we will begin our program with an unhappy note, I'm sorry to say. Paul Goldberger is ill and is very, very sorry not to be with us. But true to his craft and his devotion, he's prepared some eloquent remarks that I've asked the board chairman, Roland De Silva, to share with you.
First, on behalf of all the shareholders of 969, we are very thankful and very grateful that you're honoring our friend and longtime resident, Ada Louise Huxtable. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here this morning.
Thank you.
Right. And I have the unexpected pleasure, and totally unprepared for this, by the way, to read the remarks of Paul Goldberg. So forgive me for a couple of stumbles if I make them, but I'm going to read them now to you. When Ada Louise Huxtable began her career at the New York Times in 1963, she was the first full-time architecture critic of an American newspaper. When she departed in 1981 for the next phase of her career, she was a member of the first class of MacArthur Foundation Geniuses Fellows. Almost every major newspaper had an architecture critic either as a full-time staff member or as a regular contributor, and architecture has become a more conspicuous part of the broader cultural and civic discourse than ever before. Huxtable did not, to be sure, invent her profession or single-handedly put architecture in the public eye. But no commentator or architecture before or since has had her degree of influence over the profession or impact on the public's perception of the built environment. I could cite 1,000 of her individual accomplishments: buildings saved from the wrecker's ball, new buildings better designed than they would otherwise have been, cities planned more sensibly, zoning laws written more reasonably, But in the end, they would all add up to bringing architecture out of the periphery and thrusting it absolutely and horrifically into the mainstream of our culture. This is her great achievement. Before Ada Louise Huxtable, architecture was not a part of the public dialogue as it is today in New York and all around the United States, and she is overwhelmingly responsible for this. By the time I was lucky enough to share the platform of the Times with her in the mid-1970s, the public was crying out for more opportunities to think about architecture, for more opportunities to become involved in the whole process of evaluating the built environment. It was demanding a say in the it was demanding a say in the process of planning and decision. It was no longer willing to take lying down whatever 10th-rate trash the city developers and planners wanted to throw, thanks to Ada Louise. Thank you, Ada Louise, from a very personal viewpoint. Clarity, and it's important to say courage. The public was beginning to assert itself as a force, and the city was monstrously better for it. Her success at establishing architecture as a subject for regular criticism in the cultural pages of a major newspaper led her to writing the first Pulitzer Prize for distinguished criticism in 1970. The award, the highest honor in journalism, confirmed her stature and undiscovered the extent to which she had brought architecture to the attention of the general public. Huxtable, like few other critics, managed to seem at once relaxed and authoritative. She protected an impassioned belief in the potential of modernism to create high art, as well as a love of great architecture of every historic period. And while she always knew her constituency was the lay public and not the architecture profession, she never pandered to the populist instincts. She wrote, she once said, "From the belief that everyone deserves and has a right to standards of quality, humanity, and yes, even art, because art elevates the experience and pleasure of the places where we live and work." Where she lived and worked for most of her life was here at 969 Park Avenue, in the middle of the city that gave her excitement, enlightenment, and frustration, often in equal measures. Excuse me. She escaped often to her beloved Marblehead on the Massachusetts coast, but this building, like New York itself, was her touchstone, and she learned from it and from Park Avenue. Incredible lessons about the nature of urban design, lessons she shared with all of us. Time and time again, like so much about New York, this building is an everyday place, and it is a very special one that at the same time, but will never again, let me repeat, it will never again be quite so special as it was when Ada Louise made it her home and viewed the world from high above 82nd Street and Park Avenue. Thank you very much.
Julie Evine is an architecture reporter, editor and author, who writes the architecture column for the Wall Street Journal. After her graduation from Yale University with a degree in classics, she worked for Cesar Pelli, then the dean of the Yale School of Architecture. Julie Evine has spent over a decade at the New York Times and the New York Times Magazine, writing about architecture and design. She was then executive editor for 5 years of the Architects newspaper with an international base. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you.
It was my great fortune and really a deep joy to have had the chance to get to know Ada Louise in her years while we both were writing for the Wall Street Journal. I would actually come here about once a month when she wasn't in Marblehead to have tea, and we would have tea and cookies and gossip and chat, and then we'd keep gossiping and chatting until it turned into wine and crackers, because she wanted so much to know everything, to understand everything, whether she was just voraciously interested, and she read the blogs, she read the website, she followed controversies, she was emailing late into the night, always trying to find out what was going on, whether it was delving into the eminent domain arguments about Manhattanville versus Atlantic Yards, or she noticed that Zaha Hadid, the British architect, had a groupie following, and she thought that might be a distraction. She hoped that Richard Kershalik down in Washington, D.C. would be able to do that blue bubble at the Hirshhorn because she thought it would give a poke to the staid architectural scene in Washington. She was worried that Frank Gehry's sculptural daring made the real quality of his work difficult to read. And she found Jean Nouvel, who's doing the Super Tower at MoMA, thought that his in-your-face flair, as she put it, was hard to take. And she dismissed Norman Foster entirely as a quote, top-drawer corporate efficiency that was utterly deadly. For her, always boorish, monumental, inauthentic were crimes against the built environment and good taste. And the good fight was always against developer greed, government apathy, and corporate arrogance. Her soft spot, she once told me, was mavericks and idiosyncrasy. But in her inimitable down-to-earth provisos, they had to be talented to pull that off. I imagine there's not a writer on architecture in this country who hasn't tried to fathom and distill that magic ingredient that made hers the last word on almost every single architectural debate, whether it was the Venetian lollipops at 2 Columbus Circle or the willful arrogance of New York Public Library trying to update a masterpiece. But we can really never pin it down, and that's not because she was so very complicated, because her principles were really classically modernist, but because what she wrote was so deeply entwined and informed by events as they played out. Her delivery was clarity itself, writing with an uncanny ability to parse nuances and give context to decisions as they twisted their twisty ways through the system. In fact, she once advised me, the closest she came to advising me was to say, follow the trail of the money. But writing the present was her strength and her contribution. And you have to remember that she did it almost entirely without the splashy photographs that are the sine qua non of architectural writing today. She just had the words. But she worried that newspapers no longer understood or supported her kind of wide-ranging and comprehensive criticism. And I want to read to you the most complete statement that she made about the job, actually her job as she saw it, in an email to me. It requires knowledge of architectural history and theory, the physical and aesthetic aspects of structural engineering, economics, law, and specific civic procedures. And it comes with an obligation to help the public understand how to look at and judge buildings as art, urbanism, and places to work and to love. In other words, love and ULURP kind of both were on the same level of importance. She generally tended to dismiss events like this. I don't think she would have, the efforts to honor her were of no interest to her, but she did write finally in that same email, I'm just grateful some people remember. There, that's my first and last word on the subject. I don't discuss it, but not because I don't care. In fact, she might not have come to this plaque laying, but from Marblehead, from which she'd really love to see New York, it wouldn't have been because she wasn't happy about it. Thank you.
And now Michael Kimmelman, author and longtime chief art critic for the New York Times, became the newspaper's architecture critic in 2011, and his articles since then have helped to reshape the public debate about urbanism, architecture, and architecture criticism. Born and raised in New York City, he received an MA in art history from Harvard University, was also a fellow at the London School of Economics, a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize in 2000 and 2000. For nearly 4 years, he wrote and created the Abroad column for the New York Times, covering culture and politics all across Europe and even some parts of the Middle East. A regular contributor to the New York Review of Books, he is also a talented performing artist who still performs as a pianist and soloist in New York City and Europe. And we're waiting for that occasion to hear it as well. But not to laugh, we have one in mind. In the meantime, may I present Michael Kimmelman.
Thank you very much. I'm grateful there isn't a piano here this morning, actually. I'll echo some of the thoughts that, the wonderful things that Paul and Julie have said. I should say that living in Berlin for years, I was struck by the ways in which buildings were commemorated through the people who lived in there, plaques everywhere in Berlin, even in the sidewalks and on buildings. And it is an extraordinary and important thing I think we do to provide future generations with a way to unpack our cities and their histories, the people whom we value, the things we care most about. I happen to live on the west side in a building that has a plaque claiming that Rachmaninoff lived in it. I hope that's true. And I think it's true. Some of the things Julie was just saying about Ada Louise as well, that and Barbaralee, that I think she'd be pleased. I certainly am that we've had the news yesterday about the delay, at least, of the East Midtown plan. If we can rethink it, I think the public process is something she believed in deeply, as we all do, and it was proof that it still works. And I'm kind of with her with Norman Foster too, but that's another subject. I do believe in entitlement, she said. We are all consumers of architecture. We are all entitled to something good. I came from the belief, she added, that architecture is a social art. It's a great art, but it's a social art. It has to work, and it has to serve people. Likewise, she wrote about, quote, that extra dimension of dignity or delight and the elevated sense of self that the art of building can provide through the nature of the places where we live and work. What counts more than style is whether architecture improves our experience of the built world. That was Ada Louise. She had style, but she knew what really mattered. And she made people care. You know, we stand here today, I echo Paul's thought, because she, more than anyone, turned architectural criticism and the debate over our built environment into front-page news, literally. No less critical to the public conversation than healthcare or politics, and no less of an art than painting or sculpture, which architecture wasn't and isn't. It wasn't sculpture, which people happen to live and work in, she always made clear. Clarity was her aesthetic beacon, an uncompromising clarity. It accounted for her attachment, I think, to high modernism and her distaste for its dilution. Neo-penitentiary modern, she famously called Gordon Buncheff's Hirshhorn Museum, so I'm interested to know that she liked to see the idea of it. It was adorned with some giant balloon-like sculpture, yeah. I read her as a boy and owe to her a sense of what a critic can be, should do. She inspired me, as she did so many others. I can't begin to describe how important her words of support were after I had started as the Times' architecture critic 2 years ago. We met for occasional lunches around the corner. We talked about the city. She reminded me that we had crossed paths in Bilbao when Tom Krenz, the Guggenheim's director at the time, had tried to seduce her with a magnum of champagne. Only Ada Louise could still look formidable and then totally at ease, holding a bottle as big as she was. She didn't only love modern buildings, she loved traditional ones too, which were true to themselves, like this one, doing as much as anyone to promote historic preservation during its first decades, writing famously after the demolition of Pennsylvania Station that, quote, we may be known as a culture not by the monuments we have built, but by the ones we have destroyed. I think it's an important conversation to recall now, as we think again, for the first time really since then, about the possibility of redeeming that calamity. And nearly half a century later, she dedicated her last piece to denouncing the New York Public Library proposal, as Julie mentioned, the proposal to insert a circulating branch into the stacks of its 42nd Street landmark building. You don't update a masterpiece, she warned, and the same could be said of her.
Thank you all for your really wonderful words. They have resonance today and going forward. Before we unveil the cultural medallion to honor the life and work of Ada Louise Huxtable, I want to tell you about the program. There are more than 100 cultural medallions that have been installed throughout all of New York City. The next medallion ceremony will take place, 2 of them, on December 12th at noon at 2 Fifth Avenue, the former residence of Mayor Edward Koch on his birthday, and at least 2 mayors will come to speak. That same day, at 3 p.m., the former residence of Lincoln Kirstein, who made such an extraordinary contribution to the life and culture of New York City, first with the precursor to the Museum of Modern Art, and then, of course, with his founding of the New York City Ballet, among his many other accomplishments. That will be at 19th Street, and interestingly enough, the current owner of that house is director George C. Wolfe, and Jacques d'Amboise and Jennifer Homans will speak. I tell you this because each and all of you are invited to attend, as is the case with all of our public ceremonies. And most of these nominations come from the public. This one actually came from us, but most of them come from the public. There's a long queue, but we are always interested in your evaluations and your comments. If you see HLPC culturalmedallions.org, you will find a little form that you can send to us when you choose to nominate someone. But it has to be verifiable information, and the building will still be standing. And now I'm going to ask Deborah Bershad to read the text of the Ada Louise Cultural Medallion.
Ada Louise Huxtable, March 14, 1921 to January 7, 2013, 969 Park Avenue, Manhattan. A pioneering critic who made architecture part of the public discourse, Ada Louise Huxtable was the first full-time architect critic on any American newspaper when named to that position at the New York Times in 1963. In 1970, she was awarded the first Pulitzer Prize for distinguished criticism. She left the New York Times in 1981 to become one of the first MacArthur Fellows, and from 1997 to 2012, she was architecture critic of the Wall Street Journal. Known as the Dean of American Architectural Criticism, she was the author of 11 books. A magna cum laude graduate of Hunter College, 1941, in 1942, she married industrial designer L. Garth Huxtable.
Thank you, and thanks to each and all of you for joining us here today to honor the life and the work of Ada Louise Huxtable, here where history was made. Thank you for your part in making this ceremony possible.